digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. This week we're joined by an array of Americans, no less. We have with us, once again, Alan Slott joins us again. We have the lovely Kathy Haxel is joining us, and we have Samantha Wolf. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Tanya. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to briefly ask you to explain exactly who you are and what you do. Now, Alan, you've been on the show already, so our lovely listeners will know a little bit about you, but would you like to give us a quick snapshot of what you've been up to?
Yeah, so I'm a digital marketer. I've been doing it for more than a decade. I call myself a growth marketer / growth hacker, which I like that title more, but nobody else does. So I'll take it. I've worked across a bunch of industries, including market research, most recently for a technology company in the healthcare sector. And I'm kind of diving a little bit into immersive tech more recently. And yeah, that's about it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now, Kathy, the legend that is Kathy Haxel, would you care to explain to us all about what you have been up to?
Thank you, Tanya. So I'm a marketing futurist. I come to VR and AR from a journalism background. I'm actually going to be joining HTC Vive as a virtual reality evangelist. So just a lot of stuff going on right now, and obviously what I'm doing.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Samantha, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you've been up to?
Sure. Well, I'm a branding and marketing strategist. I have dove relatively recently into VR and AR. My background's in television. I work for sort of television and television technology companies in marketing and branding roles. And now I'm fully immersed in the New York City VR and AR marketplace.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to dive straight into this just because anybody who listens to this show now knows that I have a certain group of bugbears when it comes to immersive technologies. And I'm going to revisit one of these because I know that Alan and I have had this conversation before. And that's around the moral and ethical guidance when it comes to immersive technologies, immersive entertainment formats. And the reason I'm going to kind of go back into ranting on about this is for twofold. First of all, because there are still quite a lot of people on the game end of immersive tech who love, for some reason I have yet to fully understand why they love doing this so much, creating horror experiences for VR, which personally I cannot abide because I still am of the stance that you're traumatizing people, and I don't understand why anybody would want to traumatize somebody for the first time when they're going into immersive entertainment. But it's a cheap thrill, it's a quick thrill. And one of the reasons that I kind of want to revisit this is because there is an inherent link here when it comes to marketing. And this idea that marketeers keep on falling back on the tried and tested tropes, if you like, of how to get a quick thrill or a cheap reaction from their audience. And I wonder if there perhaps is a danger that with marketers who are stepping into immersive technologies and utilizing VR or AR for the first time in a campaign, that they aren't perhaps going with the quickest, easiest win, which invariably is the thing that's going to get the biggest scream or the biggest laugh or the biggest shock, rather than something that is actually meaningful, impactful, or more importantly, measurable. And I am curious, Kathy, from your perspective, whether or not you think that there is perhaps a bit of a danger that, especially for those marketeers and those agencies who don't have a huge amount of experience in immersive tech, that there is perhaps a little bit of this kind of us too approach to their campaigns and the things that they're doing in immersive tech.
I definitely think so. I definitely think I completely agree with what you're saying, in the sense that since it's so new and there's so much need for education for marketers that are not really immersed in this like we are, I feel like there's times where they tend to go to the easiest way or try to do something similar that they've seen without realizing that the fact that these new technologies actually give you an opportunity to create new things that are were completely impossible in the past. So I don't think that they're thinking beyond the flat. They're trying to bring the flat into the immersive. And I think that that's kind of one of the things that could be really, really negative, especially if it's a branded experience. I think it could be really negative for the consumer. That being said, when you were saying all these things, a story came to mind. So I was talking to a friend the other day, and she mentioned a story about a CEO from a large company that came to his creative agency and said, hey, I want virtual reality experience. So they set apart a big budget, they created a virtual reality experience, and they show up at his office with a virtual reality headset. And the CEO is like, no, I don't want that. I want that Pokemon Go thing, Pokemon. And all of a sudden it's like, he didn't want VR, he wanted AR. So it's exactly one of those things where I think that the root of a lot of things that will go wrong is the lack of education and the lack of understanding what these technologies can do.
It's interesting that you say this, because I know, Alan, when we spoke with Maxim last time around, we kind of came out with the conclusion that actually a lot of marketers have never even tried a headset. When you say HMD, they kind of are a little bit confused about what that necessarily means, and they're not necessarily within the tech. And I'm curious from your perspective on this, since you, as you say, are kind of coming in still reasonably new to immersive tech, whether or not you're kind of seeing the sharp end of what Kathy's talking about there, which is this idea that people might be asking for one thing, but what they really mean is something actually completely different. And there is that fundamental lack of understanding.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, again, if you haven't actually experienced it, then you don't really know what it is you're asking for. And you could know the tech terms. And obviously, in Kathy's story case, they didn't know the tech terms. I'm even, just learning them. But it is a case of, again, marketers haven't been able to actually put on a headset. They don't even know about the technology. So when you ask them to do a project in an AR environment or a VR environment or a 360 environment or whatever that may be, they don't really know how to use it because they're not experienced in it. They haven't seen enough of it. And again, a marketer is going to go for what a marketer knows is, how am I going to get the most clicks? How am I going to get the most eyeballs? How am I going to get the most views? And that's what they go for first. So without really experiencing it, you don't really understand the implications of what you're doing.
Okay, which brings me to, I suppose, a quite natural question for you, Sam, which is, when you're talking about people who are coming at this maybe from more of a cinematic or a kind of a TV background, that key metric, if you like, that thing that they care about is obviously audience size and the amount of people who are watching something. Whereas maybe from somebody like Alan's perspective, or more of a core marketeer's perspective, you're looking at, how are people engaging rather than how many people are watching. And I'm curious from your perspective whether or not you've seen any kind of a shift in the attitude and mentality of people when they are kind of commissioning these experiences or thinking about putting together these experiences, whether or not there is a shift in thinking about what is this key metric that I really care about? Because I think there's still a lot of confusion about what those key metrics are and what actually as a metric is valuable when it comes to immersive entertainment.
Well, I think some of it is just assuming that VR into of itself can be a campaign. And I don't think that it necessarily is. I think it's part of a campaign. I think it can be integrated into a campaign. And until you have sort of broad distribution with it can't sort of live unto itself. I tend to think of it almost as if it were the event part of your budget. And the event agencies that I've spoken to have been sort of, whether they wanted to or not, starting to work on VR, because it's, VR into itself is almost like a portable event. You're having that immersive experience either in the physical world or virtual world. And I think that you need to take it and realize that, and then also think of it as, the potential for multi-platform, but instead of multi-platform in the sense of, we're going to have a TV ad, and then we're going to have a print ad, and then we're going to have our digital campaign, that you think, I'm going to have my VR experience. I'm going to have my 360 experience that's either, a magic window kind of experience, and then we'll have the one that's flat, and go into a creative brief having all of those listed and understand how each of those experiences are going to affect you. I'm wondering if I can just touch a little bit on the question that you had asked before about emotions, because I was actually a psychology major in college years ago. And so it's sort of, I wondered, what's attracting me to VR and AR so much. And I think that some of that interest in psychology is related to that. And I think that that's in the creative brief for these kind of experiences. You have to think, like, what emotion am I trying to evoke? And it can't just be fear. It's much more complicated than that. I had a woman that I have met who works for a company called Unruly, and they do sort of like what makes something viral. And it is related to emotions. And they were able to list, I don't even know how many it was. I wish I had it off the top of my head, but like, let's say 20 emotions that you can evoke with your commercial to make it viral. And I feel like there hasn't been necessarily enough research yet done on VR to be able to only use VR research to prove that your campaign will work ahead of time, or to guesstimate that it will work ahead of time. I think we have to borrow from things like viral online video or television or whatever to be able to think about it and justify it.
I find this really interesting, first of all, because I am aware of the team at Unruly and some of the work that they've done, but also because of what you're talking about there, which is this idea of utilising the existing research from other areas and I suppose applying the common sense, if you like, of those findings into where we could potentially be going with immersive entertainment. And I always use this term immersive entertainment rather than VR and AR because frankly I prefer that than alphabet soup. I kind of I wanted to throw this into the ring because again I've made this statement many times at conferences when I'm speaking, and I'm kind of going to throw this out there again, which is this idea that the film industry started out with black and white steam train coming at you from a screen and people apparently running from the theatre screaming because they thought they were about to be run over by the train, and they've kind of gone from that to something like Avatar in the space of 150-ish years, give or take. And the games industry kind of went from, Pong to The Last of Us. And it took them a good chunk of a couple of decades to get to that stage as well. And VR in its even in its technical form has been around for somewhere in the general ballpark of about 30 years. And if we look at the more recent wave, maybe about 5 years, give or take. But there is still this expectation that somehow it will evolve as rapidly or have come as far as both TV and game and film and game has taken hundreds of years to actually get to that stage. But with VR and AR, it will have managed to somehow get to that same stage within the space of maybe between 5 and 30 years, which is impractical when you apply some logical thinking to that. And in the same way, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think that there is this inherent disconnect between the thinking that you would apply to something like, for example, existing marketing channels such as doing your print and your cinema and your out of home and your pay-per-click advertising versus what you would do with your immersive entertainment line of spend if you were going to do VR and AR. And there is this, as you say, this inherent lack of understanding of the emotions that you're trying to invoke with that advertising and what the application, the smart application of the technology would actually be. Because I think there are a lot of people who still think of it as very, and this is going to sound weird to kind of apply this term to it, but one-dimensional, in as much as I want to shock and awe people. I want to scare people. I want to, I want it to be the empathy machine or whatever those singular phrases are that people are trying to create with the technology. But I wonder if, and I'm throwing this one at you, Kathy, whether or not we think that perhaps there is a lack of more emotionally intelligent thinking when it comes to what we can invoke with this experience, with this technology in the broader sense of the bigger picture of it's part of a journey of marketing. It's a part of a larger, much broader campaign. We talk about things like the ARG campaigns that we've seen for things like the Hunger Games and we saw for Dark Knight and with the I Love Bees with Halo and all of these types of campaigns that people like Susan Bond and Jeff Gomez have been working on since almost a decade now. Do you think that perhaps we are lacking some of that smart thinking?
I do think so. I do sometimes run into issues with the word empathy in the sense that we are selling, the way I see it, and I read an article about this, and it really does make it say we're selling virtual reality as an empathy machine. And while I do feel that in my case, especially virtual reality, I got into virtual reality after I experienced confinement. And that really kind of turned a switch back on for me. I do think it can create empathy, but more so, I think, for it to get to that next level that you're referring to, I think that beyond empathy, what it really needs to create is compassion, because empathy just makes you feel bad for someone. You know, it makes me like, oh, it's horrible that they're trapped in this cell. But compassion actually leads to action. And that's kind of where I fight even with myself when I use the word empathy. I feel like we need to be very careful as industry professionals in the VR and AR space of the words that we're using and how we're selling this to mass market. I think it's extremely powerful. I think it definitely can help us feel very strong feelings and make amazing connections. But I think that we also need to be very careful with the way we're framing things and with the experiences we're creating as we lay the ground. I mean, we're all laying the ground for what this is going to become. So, you know, and I don't want to get too far ahead into the conversation, but I do think that we also need to look at what is going to fuel the next, you know, the future of VR and AR. I usually think I go back to, you know, we're going to need stronger connectivities, 5G, 6G. We're going to need blockchain as a repository and transparency for content. We're going to need artificial intelligence as well. So that's kind of, I don't want to put too much into this answer because I just loaded that answer with a lot of stuff.
Don't worry, we can go there.
Yeah, but that's kind of where my mind goes when I think about what implications do we have for this technology in the future. And it's not just about immersive. It's about all this emerging tech kind of coming together, and what is that going to look like in the future from a community, from a society standpoint.
It's interesting that you say this because, first of all, I'm going to kind of go back to the narrowing of the terminology there, moving from empathy to compassion, because I actually think this is very, very important stuff. And one of the things that not enough people are talking about, which is people talk about this idea of, you know, people are creating VR and there's the whole and so what moment after you finish a piece of VR and you're kind of like, that was brilliant. It made me feel very emotional. And what do you want me to do now? And there is this kind of lack of connection almost, as you say, that the difference between empathy, where you're just experiencing the emotion, versus compassion, where you say, okay, I understand, and now I want to do something about it. And it's that doing something. We're
missing the call to action.
Exactly.
We're missing that call to action.
And I find that incredibly interesting because there is a real fundamental gap when it comes to asking for that next step, or at least giving a signpost to that next step. And I think this is one of those things that Alan, you know, we've discussed this on a few occasions where we have talked about this lack of call to action, this lack of next step, where there isn't really an understanding of the more tangible return on the investment for why you're doing the specific piece of VR or AR. And I'm kind of curious from the perspective of where Kathy was taking this, because I'm gonna follow you down this rabbit hole, Kathy.
Do it.
in as much as
I'm on board because I'm ready for this.
I know that you love this stuff. This is why I'm directing this one at you. In as much as I think that Kathy's absolutely on the money, and I think that yes, if anybody who is working in the VR industry, and I say specifically state VR here rather than AR industry, then we ought to know by now that it is not a purist VR future. There is no way that this technology stands on its own 2 feet in the future. It is going to be a combination of other technologies, whether that is with blockchain as a form of cryptocurrency or as a form of container for data, whether it's the application of big data, whether that is looking at haptics and voice control and looking at, you know, all of these different types of technology and fundamentally AI that will be needed in order to really take VR from where it's at right now into something that becomes a fundamental mainstream part of everyday life, in the same way that we have all as a society created a dependency upon technology such as our mobile phones, where nowadays if you say to somebody, I'm going to take your mobile phone, you can't make any phone calls, you can't do anything with your mobile device, there is actually a sense of panic that people have. There's a physical and emotional reaction to that disconnect from technology. This is why people talk about digital detox, because it is literally detoxing the mind and the body from that dependency on technology. And so I'm curious, Alan, from your perspective, when we talk about these peripheral technologies that at the moment people are still talking about them as kind of quite secondary, but actually they are very fundamental to the future of VR. What is your take on this? What is your view in terms of what you think is going to be the roadmap that we're going to see happen when it comes to these technologies being integrated into what we A, are experiencing, but B, what we're doing with these experiences.
And I'm going to go back to Kathy's point, and Kathy, you may appreciate this. I'm going to answer the question, but it'll connect. Trust me. So, anyways, I've been working in the healthcare industry for the past 3 years. I've actually been in the behavioral health industry. So I had in the past, and going back to your statement about in VR, you're not just trying to evoke an emotion. You're trying to create an experience. And about 3 months ago, had the opportunity to actually demo some behavioral health VR programs that are meant to treat phobias. And I thought to myself, wow, as I was in there, obviously I was thinking as a marketer, I thought to myself, wow, if you can use this technology to heal, phobias, to help people get over their phobias, then you can definitely use this technology to market to people. And one of the things that they were doing there, which I again, thinking as a marketer, I apologize, but they were taking biometrics. Yeah. I mean, they were taking biometrics of their people there. They were getting ready actually to start putting neurotransmitters on people as they were in these seats, as they were in these environments. And I thought to myself immediately, there's the future of market research. That's the future of market research. Yeah. There's not going to be focus groups anymore where people are just writing down notes and asking you what your thoughts are. You're going to stick somebody. You're actually going to stick somebody in a seat in a VR environment and know exactly what they're feeling and how they're feeling.
It's actually the term that's being used for this is called biomarketing.
Yeah. And here's the funny thing is now we're getting into Black Mirror territory, which is yes, it could be utilized in an interesting, meaningful way to gather data and do research and help to inform not just marketeers, but, all manner of different people, like your healthcare specialists, your doctors, or, your teachers, or your therapist or whoever, about what's going on with you, what's going on with your physical condition and your mental condition, and connecting the two together. But in the same way, that leaves a certain degree of vulnerability to those people who are not thinking about the health and well-being of the individual, of the user and the audience, but more about the profit, if you like, or the bottom line of the company. And at what point do we need to be more conscious about the safety of the user and the safety of this audience when we take into consideration that right now, we as an industry are very much in our bubble. We are at the front end, at the very sharp end of all of this. And the things that we're dabbling with right now, things that, for example, Alan experienced with Brie, I believe it was in New York, you're talking about stuff that for the mainstream population, they're probably not going to come across this for another maybe 5, if not 10 years before it becomes an everyday part of their life. And so the decisions that we make here and now are the things that the mainstream population will have to essentially live with because we've already made the decisions in maybe 5 or even in 10 years' time. And so who is being the social and moral compass when it comes to these decisions that we make as an industry? Because right now, there isn't really enough of a sense of responsibility, in my opinion. And I would love to hear, Sam, what your thoughts are on this, bearing in mind that you're very much exposed to the front line of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is, VR, if we're talking about VR specifically, is really sort of a form of mind control, if you think about it that way. And so you have that kind of, you have to have it controlled. You have to know what kind of experience you want to have with the consumer. And so I think that, I'm a little biased because I'm like, it's the brand managers, the marketing directors, all of them need to think about that. But it's a little bit different than, actually, it's a lot different than if you're going to watch a scary movie, or if you're going to watch a really sad documentary about some horrible thing going on. With VR, you remember your experience as if it was your own memories. And so there needs to be a certain amount of guidelines like there are in other media industries. And I think it should be probably sooner rather than later that they're established and people follow them. Because advertising could get, super overwhelming. I know somebody who has watched many VR experiences. He curates these experiences for film festivals, and he said he was in one experience and they like slaughtered some animal right in front of him, and even he, who is a big advocate of this medium, was like, "Is this really necessary? Like, can you?"
Bit of warning first.
Your point. Yeah, it's like, or at least tell me that's going to happen.
Yes.
Because you need to think about the people that are walking in, putting on that headset are entrusting you as creators, as marketers, as branders with the experience they're about to have. And if you wouldn't put them in a room and effectively slaughter some animal in front of them, then don't put them in a VR experience having that same kind of thing. You can have something that's amazingly interesting and amazingly effective and has a great call to action, and that you have the post VR experience that really will help sell your brand. But you have to think of the moral applications, and I think only an industry sort of wide acceptance of that is going to sort of affect those outliers who don't have as much of a moral compass when creating these experiences.
I find this really interesting in as much as one of the things that you're talking about there, this idea of when we experience something in a virtual reality environment, we essentially, the cognitive memory functions differently to when we observe a game or a movie, in as much as when we observe a game or a movie, we remember the frame and we remember that it was within a frame, and so we are distanced from the experience. Whereas when we experience something in VR, we remember it as if it was something that happened to us because we don't have that frame anymore. And when we talk about psychological therapy as for example, one of the exercises that they will sometimes give to a person who's suffered from some form of trauma is for them to remember the experience and remember it within a frame, because the more they remember it within a frame, the more they distance themselves from the trauma. And in some ways, when we create immersive content and immersive experiences, we're actually doing the opposite. We're creating a direct memory and therefore a direct trauma that we can implant into somebody's brain. And when you think about it in that context, what we're really talking about in some cases is direct behavioral therapy, direct cognitive memory influence. And I don't think a lot of people think about that when they're creating these experiences, is just how much impact they can have on a person. And here's the reason I'm bringing this up, and I'm throwing this one out to you, Kathy. And the reason I'm bringing it up in this particular way is because I think that Sam is absolutely right in as much as it needs to be something that comes from an industry-wide, very large-scale kind of approach to how we, I'm not going to say police, but how we guide people who are doing this kind of thing. Because when you're creating content, there is at the moment a little bit of a goldmine rush towards content, in the same way that, back in, 10 years ago, people were like, I need a mobile website, I need a mobile app, we've got to be mobile first. And when you asked somebody instead of why, they would kind of look at you and go, because everybody else is. And they didn't necessarily understand why they were doing it. And I think it's kind of the same with VR at this moment in time, which is people say, I want a 360 film, or I want a VR experience. And you say, why? And they kind of look at you, because it's cool. And they don't really understand why they're doing it.
Makes sense. Yeah. It's gotta make sense in VR and AR for sure, in order to do an experience, Tanya. So
but I think that's part of the thing is that there are a lot of people who are doing it just because they can and not because they should. And oftentimes you look at an experience and you're kind of like, and why wouldn't you have just done that in 2D? And
yeah, I think it's still gimmicky. I mean, in some ways, it's still very gimmicky. And I think that a lot of people that are, creatives that think that they can do this just because they, I think you need experts. I think brands and people, brands need definitely experts that can really deliver and that really understand the technology. That being said, I do want to go back to that idea of best practices and setting up the ground for what our industry can become. I'm part of the VR AR Association, and I know one of the things that we're trying to do is kind of come up with those best practices. I also know that and this is kind of further out, I'm a futurist, so I always go out there. From a human augmentation standpoint, there's already several meetings happening. There's one that happened last year in New York. I think it's happening this year, to try to set up kind of what are the parameters and what are the best practices towards that. So I think that this is a very important conversation. I was discussing this with my friend Vito Divari. He's one of the top 3 futurists in the world or something. At least that's what he tells me. and he and I were having a conversation about how, in his mind, for him, mixed reality is the new premium. This is kind of what he says. And he says brands or companies are going to create worlds. They're going to create these worlds that people are going to pay to be a part of. And those that can't afford to be part of these worlds and these experiences, what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to see a lot of advertising. They're going to have to give up a lot more data, et cetera. So it's a really interesting conversation, because what are we going to turn this future into? You know, I'm not dystopian about it. I don't look at, you've probably watched Hyper Reality, obviously.
I have spoken on that panel with the creator of Hyper Reality.
Fantastic. Exactly. So I don't see my future as a hyper reality where it's like you're being bombarded. I really want to see it more utopian, where, especially from an augmented reality standpoint, where augmented reality brings utility and context. That is my ultimate goal. I think that for AR to be mainstream, it has to be useful, and it needs to provide the right type of context for users. So I don't see that future as a hyper reality. I want to see it more as a very positive thing. But I do think that those are the conversations that we need to have right now. And if we start thinking, obviously VR is in some way brain hacking, like kind of what Sam was alluding to. And biomarketing, I mean, I already have Dr. Adrian Randolph in Kennesaw State University in Georgia that's doing, amazing, mind-blowing things with biomarketing, where you have, the people going into these experiences, there's all these wires in their head. They're registering all this information. So kind of what Alan was talking about. And I think that it's exciting, but there needs to be certain safeguards. There need to be best practices, because what we want to build is something positive for the next generation. I don't want it to be Ready Player One. That's not what I want.
Oh, we could have a whole other conversation about Ready Player One, yeah. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. No. But what I am going to do is I'm going to kind of bring this back to you, Alan, which is that, what Kathy is talking about there is quite fundamental, in as much as we want this to be something that can be for the greater good of mankind, shall we say, humankind, in fact. But one of the things that I think is kind of interesting right now is this obsession almost within the industry for immersive technology, immersive content to very much be about entertainment. And oftentimes there is a bit of first of all, a lack of understanding, but a lack of insight as well, when it comes to the business to business application of the technology and the market and what it can do. And one of the things there that Kathy was talking about, this idea of biomarketing and the biometrics that are being utilized in order to help guide marketeers' decisions. You've spoken in the past about how you see this plugging into things like electronic health records, for example. And I wonder if perhaps there needs to be more discussion around the future of the business-to-business application and the reality of how much sooner business-to-business application will become part of the mainstream versus business-to-consumer, where, people are so focused on this entertainment future of VR that they're kind of forgetting that actually the business-to-business application of VR probably has much more human impact, but definitely has much more commercial impact. So would you care to expand out on your thoughts around this kind of application of electronic health record?
I think, like you said, so the virtual reality and the whole world of being in immersive technology, it's an industry of its own. But I think what's going to happen is it's going to spawn industries around it. So you have, like you were saying, with the biomarketing, which thank you for letting me know what the proper term was. But with the biomarketing, you're going to have a bunch of biomarketing agencies open up, and they're going to be testing things, and they're going to be selling that data. Depending on the usage, again, when we talk about electronic health records, when you're, and this was in the this is during an ethics thing, is having that kind of data. Like people will give up data for a better experience, and but having that data isn't necessarily a bad thing, as long as it's done properly, as long as it's done anonymously in terms of electronic health records, obviously. But if you're able to grab all of that data from every doctor or every physician who's ever given a certain treatment to a certain ailment and came out with a certain outcome, and combine all of that data together to find what the best treatment for an ailment is, that obviously helps mankind. So moving forward in the immersive tech world, it's gonna. I think you're going to see the same thing. I think you're going to see data being collected. Obviously, in case of biomarketing and biometrics, how people feel, how people react to certain things, and I think all that data eventually will come together. And I think I would hope. Let me say, I would hope that it ends up being for the betterment of mankind.
Okay, so I'm kind of curious then, when we talk about the type of application, when you're saying about, this idea of physical coalition of data and being able to come up with a treatment path, for example, one of the things that I am kind of curious about, and I'm throwing this one at you, Sam, just because you have that kind of history and background of interest here, but we live in an age, in a digital age, in a technological age where we are, as a human race, we have never been as outnumbered by screens in our life now than at any other point in history. The average human being has anywhere between 5 and 6 screens in their life, including their mobile phone, their tablet device, their TV, their laptop, their computer at work, their cinema screen, and their advertising screens that they will actively engage with at any different point in the day. And yet, as a human species, we are probably the loneliest we have ever been because of this illusion of agency, this illusion of sociability and social interaction, that things like, for example, social media have actually nurtured and articulated this idea that we're very close to the people around us, and yet we can be all sitting at dinner and everybody's staring at their own individual screen. And they've forgotten the basics of human interaction. And I wonder whether or not there is perhaps an opportunity for immersive technologies, whether that be VR or AR, to perhaps help to address that sense of digital disconnection that we have through devices and technology, given the modern era that we live in.
That's, once again, an amazing question that you asked. Again, I said, brilliant, you're brilliant.
Yeah, I just have an awkward pause when I'm gathering my thoughts.
There's so many things that come to mind based on the question that you asked in terms of the screens, the sort of the good and the bad, the both sides of the coin with all of these screens. I have been an entertainment addict, and I use that word not loosely, that I am definitely that, and a screen addict as well. I wish I remembered exactly where the study was, but I know that there are things about learning, and if you're taught by somebody sort of face to face versus if you're taught something on a screen, the retention is so much better by the person, even if it's recorded with the same exact words, the same exact gestures, that human interaction is so much better. And I keep on coming up with all these research studies. I'm not a researcher myself, but I love working with researchers. And I bet that if they said there was a VR research where they tried to do that same thing, have the person in the room and then have the VR experience with all the same gestures and all the, that it probably would be very similar, similar results as opposed to just sort of a flat screen. I know that there is the move toward social VR for sure. At least for me, I think that the avatars need to get a little bit better for me to feel super comfortable in that kind of experience. But I feel like with AR, and I hate to use Pokemon Go, but I think that it did bring massive amounts of people together to go and do something. And so I feel like that, although now at this point is, I guess, a trope unto itself, but I think that there's the potential of bringing people together so they say, have you seen this? Have you done this? It becomes a conversation piece that allows communication and further interaction. And I think that with haptics and with sort of the feedback from holograms, sort of further into the future, that sense of touch will come and be sort of very, very important to establishing these human connections. And then I'm going to throw back to an old question that you had, because it just happened to be in an article that I saw yesterday about about sort of VR and MR and all these medical records. And there was actually an article that said that there was a mixed reality headset that they did a surgery in half the time in Madrid because they were able to interact with the patient's data, CAT scans, X-rays, ultrasounds. And I think if there's more and more of that, proof that this is value in what everybody calls enterprise, which I'm like, isn't that sort of B2B? But if there's more and more of those kinds of case studies, I think that, people will realize that the value of VR and MR is way beyond a potential entertainment experience, and that it can be used for in so many different ways that it's mind-boggling.
And I would put a shout out to Shafi and Steve and the team at Medical Realities, who are doing very much the work that you're talking about there in terms of being able to collaboratively interact around medical surgeries. And they were certainly one of the first companies to actually broadcast live surgery of a cancer operation. I believe it was abdominal cancer back in April. So what I will do, though, is I'm going to throw this one back towards the general direction of Kathy and Alan on this, but I'm open to responses here. But just following on from where Sam was kind of going with this, and as much as I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again because I still think it's relevant, I still think it hasn't really changed, which is that when we talk about social collaborative VR experiences or unified experiences where multiple users can be in the same virtual environments or the same shared environments, and the fact that people who have a fundamental gaming experience background will have a distinct advantage over those who do not, because they understand the ecosystem of gaming and MMOs and massively multiplayer online games and social tiering and tribes and guilds and all these other things that gamers have been doing for decades. And I feel that in the context of a social, collaborative, shared VR environment, that these types of people who are, the people who've grown up on things like World of Warcraft and, Overwatch and all these types of shared games, that they have an advantage to understand how these things work. And in the same way that, I don't want to make it sound all dystopian or anything, but, kind of like Lord of the Flies future. These kids are going to be the ones that are going to stake out their territory first. They're going to be the ones who stake out the behaviors and the accepted standards of normal behavior in these environments. And I wonder, Kathy, and Alan for that matter, whether or not we think that there's work that needs to be done now in order to protect the broader mainstream who don't necessarily have that experience. And I say this on the basis of even now, when people are creating VR experiences from a pure VR perspective, so for tethered headsets and true VR gaming, you have two types of experience or two types of user, if you like. The first is the person who has the game's console experience, and so they are using a standard game controller with the little X buttons and the little crosses and all that, and control sticks. And then you have the other end of that user experience, which is the people who are not gamers, who don't understand game locomotion, and who will naturally just try to reach out and grab a cup or grab a door handle or push something, because that's the expectation of how real physics work in the real world. And I'm curious whether or not we think that perhaps the people with that game knowledge, that game history, perhaps the introverts of this world, have a distinct advantage.
I think they do have an advantage, but I also see this, Tanya, from a different perspective. So I have 3 small children, and my 2 older ones, I let them play in VR, not for long amounts of time, but I do let them play. They love Google Tilt Brush, etc. So those sorts of things, they've experienced several things, and they love it. And I observed something really interesting. I took them to Disney World, and we got on the Star Wars ride, which is 3D. Okay. And they were sitting there wearing these glasses, going through this experience, and they just kept kind of like raising their glasses up and down, kind of like trying to figure out what this was. And when we got off, they said, "Mommy, this would have been so much better in virtual reality." And they're not gamers per se. I think that they're, obviously because they're still young, they're not gamers per se. So while I do think that gamers have an advantage, I do see that the younger generations just think in 3D 360. So they will have a better and easier way adopting these technologies. Another example of this is when you give a kid Google Tilt Brush, which is the program they use to make drawings and paint. Most adults tend to draw flat things, like draw their name or write or make a little house or something. I've seen kids draw igloos around them. And they understand that, Yeah, go ahead, Tani.
No, it's interesting you say this, because I've referred to this example before in the past where I believe we were at Wired Generations, I think it was the event last year, and there were kids as young as kind of 6 and 8 years old who, they're putting this headset on and they were playing with Tilt Brush for the first time. And at first, you're watching everybody kind of gather around the monitor and they're all kind of tilting their head to the side because they're trying to figure out what it is that this kid is kind of ducking and diving and weaving and bobbing. And you're like, what is that? What are they doing? And it took maybe 10, 15 minutes for everybody around the room to kind of realize what she was doing. And the more people where you could see like the cognitive click in their brain when they realized what she was doing, and they were all they were drawing towards this monitor because they were like, oh my goodness, I can't believe she just did that. And she had literally drawn a spaceship around her, and she had created the little astronaut sitting in the spaceship. There was an astronaut who was tethered to the outside of the ship who was on a spacewalk, but she'd drawn the entire solar system outside of the spaceship, accurately, I might add. And all of this stuff that she'd done it in all with this spatial awareness of what was going on around her. Yeah. That just, the adults in the room, you could just see them like in shock and awe, kind of like, wow, how come I can't think like this? And I think you're absolutely right that younger people do have that openness to thinking with the spatial awareness in mind that perhaps we as adults have already kind of trained ourselves out of thinking in that way. But
yeah, and definitely, I mean, I think that they see things in a very different way. I also feel, so while gamers will have an advantage, I'm not going to say that they don't. I do see this younger generation. I even call them sometimes virtual natives. I've been wrote about that like back in September 2016. But I also see something really interesting, that while gamers do have some advantage, I see that virtual reality, if it's a social experience, can actually bring people of all different ages and cultures together. And this is why I say this. Let's go to the World Cup. Okay, let's go to the World Cup. And a lot of people are going to watch it in a flat screen. But later on, when these games will be available in a 360 view, real time, why wouldn't I want to sit down in my sofa, put on a headset, and have my dad, who's in Costa Rica, put on a headset and go into the game with him? We're not flying to Russia, but experience that together. Especially something like the World Cup that just really has the world's attention. I think that there's huge potential there for people that are not virtual natives or that are not native born gamers. I think that there is a huge potential there. That being said, and I will go to this. We have to be very careful, because I personally will not put my children in a social VR experience until there are certain things that aren't resolved. I have been in social VR. I went to a book launch, not my book, but a different book many months ago. And I didn't even realize what was happening, but I was sexually harassed in virtual reality. Once it clicked in my brain that was happening, I said, this is not something I want my children to experience. So it's twofold. So I just want to kind of I know that I'm going really broad with my answers, but I'm just really, I just feel this is an awesome conversation.
I kind of wanted to add to that a little bit, because with the gamers having an advantage, and I'm not sure that they have a complete advantage, because I've noticed with AR and VR, the learning curve is a lot smaller than it is. I can't walk into Halo and do anything for any amount of time before I'm dead, but I can literally go into a VR experience and I can experience that, and I can go into an AR. Not again. I hate to bring in Pokemon, but we're gonna bring in Pokemon Go, and it was very easy for me, and it was very easy for me to use, and my friends used it, and I did interact with people, because you watched everybody, and they're like, oh, there's a polygraph over there, and and okay, well, I'm going there, and also I have an uncle who's 65 years old, who absolutely cannot get off of Pokemon Go. So I think the learning curve is a lot smaller. So I don't think there's going to be that much of an advantage moving forward.
Can I add one thing to the conversation too? I hope you don't mind. The thing for me that I have found a little bit frustrating about the industry is that it does seem to narrow its focus, at least from a target market standpoint, on these, men 18 to 24, 34 age group. And I don't think that I can't think of very many, maybe gaming into itself tends to focus on that. But I think that there's so much more opportunity for VR and AR to be thinking about a wide variety of target markets beyond them. I know that there's a story from a long time ago, and I'll use my TV story about Nickelodeon wanting to sell, get car advertisements on their network. And so they found out that kids actually have a whole lot of influence on car purchasing. And so I wonder whether it's, if you get some more of women interested in this, have more sort of diversity in creation and diversity in target, whether I hypothesize that the whole industry will grow faster, and there'll be less of a chance from the ethical standpoint that you were talking about before of an issue there. So my 2 cents on the topic.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I'm kind of curious, given that we've touched on such a broad spectrum of different issues here, what that single thing is that you think needs to happen in order to shift the way that the industry currently operates, be that a cultural thing or a technological thing, what that one thing is that's just going to help to move everything forwards. And I'm going to start with you, Alan, because you've been on the show before.
Oh, thank you. So I think the one thing that needs to shift again is probably people's perspective of what it is that they're trying to do. You are evoking an emotion. You are evoking an experience. And again, like we were talking before, it's not a framed experience. And from my point of view, if you can cure phobias through VR, you can absolutely create them. And I think we have to be very conscious of that.
Okay. Kathy, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, one of the things, and I'm going to talk specifically about augmented realities because I spend so much of my free time thinking about this, is that, and I can keep repeating this, and I say it in most of my talks, in order for augmented reality to be mainstream, it needs to be useful. It needs to bring utility, and it needs to bring context. And one of the clearest examples that I can use for this to frame it is I live in Florida. So during Hurricane Irma, I was watching the Weather Channel. And the Weather Channel started using augmented reality to kind of show what a certain amount of inches of rain looks like. So instead of having a broadcaster just tell me there's going to be 50 inches of rain, they had augmented reality show you what happens at 10 inches, what happens at 25 inches, what happens at 50 inches, just to use, not 50 inches, but, just kind of an idea. And it made me think, did this help save any lives? Visualizing this, did this help save any lives? And did it put things in context? And that just has stayed with me ever since I watched that. And I just always go back to it. And I always go back to in order for AR to be mainstream, it needs to be useful. It needs to provide context. So there's those 2 things I think are incredibly important for moving that part of the industry forward.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sam, what about you? What's your thoughts on this?
Oh my gosh, I have so many answers, but I'll try to pick these. I think you need to get more people to try headsets. I think I worked on the beginning of, on-demand video, and it was all about educating people how to use the remote differently. And so now it's getting that last sort of couple feet, to get somebody to put the headset on. I desperately want super creative minds, agencies, and, entertainment. I got into marketing and branding because I like sitting next to somebody who's much more creative than I am. I'm business creative, but somebody can really dive deeply so that you go beyond, as you said earlier in the conversation, the horror, let's shock people because all these other people are shocked. You need the real creative minds, the storytellers, the brand marketers, the brand managers who all understand and embrace this medium and really push it forward. And I think that once that happens, then consumers will come in. It will continue to evolve as an industry.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And thank you for joining us. So, as always, we like to give our listeners a way to find out a little bit more about you. And we ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. Alan, what would that be?
My social media is badass_marketer on Twitter.
Thank you. And Sam, what about yourself?
I'm Samantha G. Wolfe, WOLFE, on Twitter as well. And for the marketers and the branders that are listening, I have a Facebook and LinkedIn group that has the most uninteresting name possible, VR/AR/MR marketing and branding. And I post a few times a day, and we've got some good discussions going.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Kathy, what about yourself?
Kathy Hackle, so CATHYHACAL at Kathy Hackle on Twitter, on all social media. And if anyone's listening to this, feel free to connect with me on Twitter, on LinkedIn. I always like, having conversations with folks at, listen to me in podcasts. And also go to my website, kathyhackle.com.
Wonderful. And while I have both Kathy and Sam here, would you like to explain a little bit more about your new book?
Definitely. So our new book is called Marketing New Realities, an introduction to VR and AR marketing, branding, and communications. And we created this book to serve as an educational resource for marketers, for anyone in marketing and communications, PR, advertising, you name it, that is interested in learning more about these immersive technologies and how to incorporate them into their marketing mix. And I'll let Sam say a few words as well.
Yeah, no, the goal with the book was to sort of give the introduction to it, so the terminology, to explain what's going on now, to explain what potentially will happen in the future. And then we also have a section that's called Practical Matters. So it's sort of a resource, and harkening back to your medical examples from before, that almost like the doctor says, excuse me 1 minute, and goes into the other room and checks their medical dictionary or checks online. Like, this is for marketers and branders to sort of do the same, say, what do I need to add in that brief, or what kind of KPIs are out there that I can use, that it has that resource as well.
Yes.
And the book is at marketingnewrealities.com as well. So.
And on Amazon.
Everywhere.
It's available now. And what I will say is that I have had a chance to skim through the first half of the book. I haven't quite got to the second half of the book yet. Certainly from what I've seen, I think that for marketeers and people who are wanting to explain to others who are not within this industry, the book is a very good starting point to explain the landscape and the basics of the terminology, which can sometimes be quite difficult for people to try and articulate that to others. So definitely a very useful tool. But once again, I want to thank you very much for joining us, and I want to thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you, and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. DigitalJamSessions.com